Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Show podcast. I'm Helen Czerski and I'm popping onto the podcast this week to get stuck into a topic that really interests me. It's about the technology of the future, but it's not just what the technologies are, but what society does with them. For example, a self-driving car sounds like a really impressive technological achievement, but once you've got one, who's in charge of it? Who do you blame if there's an accident? What happens when the roads are half and half self-driving cars and half human-driven cars? And who writes the rule book? So what you're about to hear is a really interesting discussion that I had on this topic with Dr. Jack Stilgoe, who's an Associate Professor of Science and Technology Studies at University College London, which is coincidentally also my university. And I hope you enjoy it because there's loads of great stuff in here.
My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy. Driving the charge to a greener future.
Hello, Jack. Thank you for joining us on the Fully Charged podcast. We're going to be talking about the future of technology, but not so much the technology itself. And I think that you have a particularly interesting job description that most Fully Charged listeners probably aren't aware of. So just tell us what you do.
So I teach at University College London, very excellent institution, as I'm sure you'll all agree, Helen.
Yeah, because we're not biased at all.
No. I teach and research things to do with science and technology policy, and I'm particularly interested in how governments can deal with fast-moving new technologies, getting more of the good stuff from them and less of the bad stuff from them. And at the moment, I'm particularly fixated on self-driving cars.
Now, I have to say, I had a scan through your journal articles on the UCL website, and you do have some of the best titles for journals, because, you know, academic journal titles are normally a bit boring. And you've got one called Nobody Knows Anything, The Cunning of Uncertainty, which makes it sound like a baldric, cunning plan. That is, and there's also one about putting technology in its place. Are you a fan of technology?
I think I am. Yeah. So people, if you're a social scientist that looks at science and technology, you're sometimes seen by scientists and engineers as a sort of grumpy Luddite who wants to get them to stop what they're doing. And I see it in the same way as, you know, if you're a literary critic, you love what you're trying to criticize. And I see it as the same sort of way when it comes to science and technology, that I actually, you know, I want to see the world making the most of science and technology and not suffering from all of the downsides of those things, which means I think that we do need to, you know, so I see myself as a bit of a critical friend, I guess.
Now, we live in an age where lots of big tech companies and now car companies are inventing lots of things. And there's this assumption that whatever new shiny thing they come up with is always better. It's a new shiny thing. It must be better than the old, slightly scuffed up thing we had before. Why is that not always true?
So, yeah, new isn't always better for a few reasons. And I think anybody that looks at transport knows this, that, you know, when it comes to transport, we are stuck with some systems that are a set of historical accidents or poor decisions made in the past, and some of those things we need to get ourselves out of, whether it's for reasons of climate change or the fact that cities get congested, and the need to, you know, avoid what people like me call technological lock-in, right? To get ourselves out of those situations and get more of the advantages that come from new technologies.
So, what is technological lock-in? That sounds interesting.
Technological lock-in is the way in which societies get stuck with particular technology. So the example that people like me always use is the QWERTY keyboard. Right? The QWERTY keyboard doesn't work very well, but we're stuck with it for all sorts of reasons. We're stuck with it because we've got used to typing on it. We're stuck with it because when we get another laptop, it has that keyboard, so we don't want to change it. So even though it doesn't work very well, it is locked in. And in some ways, the cities that we live in are locked into particular forms of transport. Some of them in America are entirely car dependent. Some of them in Europe have a greater diversity of transport system.
So you were an author on the report called A Framework for Responsible Innovation. So what is responsible innovation then? How does that work?
So responsible innovation is about asking scientists, engineers, innovators, tech companies to take greater responsibility for the futures that they help bring about. Because in the past there have been all sorts of incentives for those groups to not think very hard about the future, right? To do the new thing, to develop the shiny new gadget, and to let society realise the effects of those things in hindsight. And sometimes that hindsight is quite grim hindsight, right? So to try to improve the foresight of innovators so that we can have a broader discussion about, where technology is taking us, how to get more of the good stuff, how to understand, anticipate and mitigate some of the risks, some of the downsides, and hopefully come up with some better policies. But it means not just letting engineers, not just leaving them to their own devices.
So don't leave an engineer alone because he might cause mischief. He or she might cause mischief. That's the message? And just
that's the message.
Do you get what kind of response do you get to that? Because a lot of the culture, especially in some of these big tech companies, and there's this thing about move fast and break things, right? I mean, the entire motivation for them is let's make it anyway, and just never mind the consequences. Do you get much pushback on this idea of responsible innovation?
Yeah, you do get a lot of... whenever you ask somebody to do something that they otherwise wouldn't have done, then that can be quite annoying. The argument that I would then tend to make was that, well, actually, if we get this right, it means that we will avoid mistakes down the track. It's notable that Facebook, for example, don't talk anymore about moving fast and breaking things because they are now... they're no longer an upstart. They're no longer, a small startup. They are the new establishment. And I guess one of the things that a responsible innovation approach would be interested in is how you can get from being a startup to being the establishment, and it not just feeling like an accident. Because I guess that's what happened with Facebook. Somewhere on the journey from a dorm room in Harvard to 2 or 3 billion users, right? Facebook could have been paying a bit more attention to the downsides of its own innovation, but that company did all of that in the space of 15 years. I mean, it's really hard to take those sort of questions into account when you're moving that quickly.
Well, let's get to a specific example then. So self-driving cars. Now you've said that you're not a car expert in this sense, but you do know a lot about the technology, the issues around self-driving cars. So could you give us a summary of the current situation with self-driving cars? What is it?
So if you were to look at what's happening with self-driving cars right now, you could look at it in some ways that would be almost entirely incompatible. Because at one level, if you live in Phoenix, Arizona, you can, on an app, call up a Waymo that doesn't have a driver in the front seat, and you can get in, and you're the only person in that car, and that car will drive you to a destination. And so in a sense, that is a self-driving car, and it's already with us, and that is remarkable. And that is extraordinary. And if you'd shown that to somebody 10 years ago, they would have thought it was witchcraft. So it's absolutely...
I think some people still do.
It's absolutely mind-blowing. And yet we can still at the same time say, well, is it good enough? And we can also think about, well, what are the conditions under which that technology works in those circumstances, and does that mean that it would work in other circumstances? So yes, you can get a driverless lift around a few blocks of Phoenix, Arizona, but that doesn't mean that if you took a driverless car to Rome, right, or
the thought of a driverless car in Rome is
I'm just
terrifying.
trying to imagine, places with rather less predictable traffic,
right? And the odd donkey and things, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess more diverse, complicated road spaces. Then the technology becomes instantly useless. So it's interesting to think about how self-driving cars are both with us and also, in some way, sort of impossibly distant. And I think that goes some way to trying to understand sort of, well, where we are. And I get asked a lot, when will we see self-driving cars? And I say, well, the question really is where, not when. Right,
well, there's this question to do with, like, how because there's levels, aren't there? I mean, even now you get cruise control isn't that new anymore, but then... And, there's been steps forward where cars are taking on control of tasks that humans used to do. And there is this kind of, I think there's a framework, there are levels, or someone's defined some levels of autonomy. Could you just walk us through those?
Yeah, so these are labels from SAE, they used to be the Society of Automotive Engineers, who talk about levels from 0 to 5, 0 being no automation and 5 being a fully automated vehicle that can drive in all circumstances, anywhere. And I have argued that level 5, the completely autonomous vehicle, if you like, is impossible. Right? There is no possibility of an artificial intelligence being able to drive anywhere at all times, because all of our mobility is shaped by our environment, right? It always depends on a particular set of conditions. There are some interesting debates to be had. For example, if you're a Tesla customer, and you can go to the Tesla website at the moment and you can pay extra money to buy the full self-driving package, which is misleading as it's currently represented, because the technology that Tesla are currently offering is actually a level 2 technology, which is in effect it's a sort of upgraded version of traffic-aware cruise control and some lane keeping, and it does some clever things like it's able to move you on and off the highway, and it recognises some traffic lights. But would you trust it to drive you from one side of a city to another? Well, I wouldn't, which isn't to say that some people aren't doing that, right? YouTube is currently full of Tesla drivers experimenting with their autopilot systems in some ways that, frankly, are terrifying, right? So part of the confusion there is that Tesla are selling a level 2 system, and they're pretending that system is a level 4 system. So level 4 would be a system that, yes, you can rely upon within a particular set of circumstances. So in a particular place, when the weather is in a particular, it is particularly benign and that sort of thing. So that's sort of conditional self-driving.
So let's get into some of the issues, because once you start, the problem almost with this topic, I think, is that once you start thinking about it, there's so many big questions about all of this. Right. And there's some really deep ethical issues, actually, in some of these things. So on the list, let's start with data, for example. So a lot of this is driven by improved computer systems, and there are cars now that send back information. They collect data about what driving is going on, and they don't just keep it in the car. But all of this, like the entire concept of self-driving cars, relies on having data sets. So because you have to teach your car. So let's talk a little bit about the data. Like what are the issues with where that data comes from, and privacy? How does all of that work?
Yeah, well, maybe let's start by just demolishing the myth that a self-driving car artificial intelligence is basically like a human being, because some people like to present that, a human being has sensors on the front of their face, not very sophisticated sensors, and they use them to process not very much information and driving isn't very hard, so a computer should be able to do that. I think the first thing to say is that AIs do not work like the human brain. They require different sensors, and just as getting an AI to play chess, you don't teach it to play chess in the same way. What you do is an approach that's sometimes called brute force, where you just throw huge amounts of data at the various AI systems that you'd have, say, within your self-driving car, which means that if a self-driving car is going to work even in a very limited set of conditions, it needs extraordinary amounts of data to learn from, which means that the computing power required is enormous, and you just need to think about the complexity of even a fairly boring daily trip in a car. The exposure to all the possible stimuli is huge. So there's the data to train the systems that are able to drive, which means that a self-driving car is peppered with sensors all over the place. It is constantly comparing its vision of the world with the vision that it is expecting, right? So it probably contains a 3D map of the world as well, and you could say, well, that's just to get it. That's just for it to, for it to do its job. It needs all of those things. But as you say, there are some really profound questions there to do with who has access to that data. Is it just contained within the car? Is it transmitted to a fleet of cars so that they can all learn from each other? And what might the cybersecurity risks of that be if a self-driving car sees a murder happening on a road? Do the police then legitimately say, in effect, you've got a surveillance network driving around on your road, so can we have access to that data? So just the availability of all of this sensing capacity has some profound questions. There's also a really important question of, when one of these things gets into a crash, do the people that regulate and try to improve the safety overall of the system have access to that data, which is the case when an aeroplane has a crash, right? We don't just say, oh yeah, Boeing can be trusted to have that data. Boeing has to give that data to the regulators so that everybody can learn from it. So the question of who learns what from data and who's allowed access to it is a really important one. At the moment, it's not really being asked, I think it's fair to say.
How do we get it? Because it feels at the moment like, if you're a consumer and you're in a showroom or whatever and you're looking at a car and some salesman is telling you how wonderful it is, it feels as though you don't have a choice about any of this stuff. If you buy a particular type of car, some stuff will happen, but you can't pay extra and choose an option where they don't have your data, right? At the moment, there's very little choice in all of this. Like, how should we have choice, or should this all happen further back? Like, how do we? It feels like there's some big questions where the consumer can't do anything at the moment. What do we do about that?
Yeah.
Do we all just have to buy into this or not buy into it as a society?
So it might be. I mean, there might be a further issue that comes from self-driving cars. There's a real question of whether it makes sense at all for consumers to have any choice over the type of self-driving car that they might in the future have access to. If you consider how complicated a self-driving car will have to be in order to do the job of getting from A to B, it might have to have an extra £100,000 worth of sensors stuck to its top, and those sensors will need to be maintained, right? And people can't be trusted to maintain those sensors so that they work. So, if you're Uber or somebody, I mean, Uber have recently sold their self-driving car arm, but they were thinking of a self-driving world in which people wouldn't want to buy a self-driving car ever, nor would it make sense to. So it would just be about you buy the trip rather than buy the car, in which case the consumer doesn't have any right to or any need to care about the particular sort of car that they're getting. I think one of the really interesting sociological implications of a self-driving future might be how it reconfigures the role of the consumer in all of this. Are we people that are still sort of buying into an automotive dream where companies are competing on speed, power, comfort, safety? Whether or not we allow companies to compete on safety at the moment, we don't allow aeroplane manufacturers to compete on safety. But yeah, I think it could be one of those really big existential issues if you are a current car maker thinking, what does my future look like? What am I selling to people in 50 years' time?
Well, trust comes up a lot in all of this, isn't it? And it has. I mean, this is the nature of the modern world. The more interconnected and complicated it gets, the less any of us are actually qualified in any way to understand all of the decisions we're being asked to make. But let's get back to the safety then. So one of the things you often hear with self-driving cars is that if there were lots of self-driving cars, the rate of accidents would go down, and therefore we should have them because fewer people would die. But then along with that safety is, first of all, the issue you raised, which is how safe is safe enough. And then there's this issue of there's a lot of ethics in safety. And the trolley problem is this classic example. So just could you say how safe is safe enough? And then if you could explain the trolley problem to us.
I'll do. Okay, how safe is safe enough this is a classic question of social science. So, engineers can't answer this question because they don't get to decide what acceptable risks people will take. And if you are an engineer, sometimes you will look at, for example, the relative safety of an aeroplane and a car, and you'll say, well, isn't it a bit irrational that people accept the risks of getting in a car, right? And a car and driving and being on the roads is probably one of the most dangerous things that most of us do. Right, more than 1 million people die every year in car crashes. It's a public health disaster, and yet fear of driving isn't as prominent a sociological concern as fear of flying. Right, lots of people are afraid of flying, even though flying is, by most measures, at least 100 times safer than driving per mile. I think. Elon Musk, for example, would say, oh, well, as long as you can improve on average levels of safety with self-driving cars, then we should just accept the technology, go for it, do it as quickly as possible. But I'm thinking, if you reduce that 1 million deaths a year to 500,000 deaths a year, is that going to be enough to persuade the mother of the child who's just been killed by a robot, right, in effect saying, oh, well, they could have died, they could have been run over by a human, and on average, the world is a much safer place than it used to be, right? Because what we know about how people think about risks is that it matters. It matters whether or not they are seen as in control of those risks. It matters whether a human is in control rather than a robot is in control. It matters who is to blame. Is it a faceless corporation or is it an individual? What are the rights of redress in the courts, right? So the question, how safe is safe enough for a self-driving car, is still really open. I just think we don't know, but my suspicion is that people are going to want them to be, as safe as planes or trains, not just a bit safer than the current disaster that is road safety.
So let's have a look. So then unless you're going to go there, just then this because the trolley problem, I think, is a really interesting example of how you get to safety, because it allows you to make a decision that a human wouldn't make, but then you have to. It's an extended version of what you just said. So perhaps explain to us what that is. So
what the trolley problem is, I actually find the trolley problem rather annoying, but I will explain it. So no, it's fine because it's an interesting thought experiment, I would say, but it's only a thought experiment. So the trolley problem, actually came about in the 1960s. A philosopher called Philippa Foot came up with this conundrum with which we were able to explore our own ethical frameworks as human beings. The idea was, and trolley is the wrong word also. Let's say you're on a train. You're on a train, and for some reason 5 people are tied to the track in front of your train.
As normal on a Tuesday afternoon,
And down there's another track with 1 person tied on it. And you have to decide, do you switch the tracks to run over that 1 person, or do you let the train carry on and kill those 5 people? And different philosophers, whether or not you're Immanuel Kant or Jeremy Bentham, you might come up with some different suggestions depending on your ethical framework.
So the point is here the difference between you can take no action or you can take an action, and it's that critical thing that splits the cases.
Yes, indeed. So if you're Immanuel Kant, you would say the taking of the action to kill a person is wrong, and therefore people shouldn't do it. Whereas if you're Jeremy Bentham, if you're a utilitarian, you would say, well, surely 5 deaths is worse than 1 death, therefore you should judge the situation by the outcome, not by the action. Now, some philosophers have said, a self-driving car gives us a real-world test case for this thing that had always been a thought experiment, which I think is a mistake, because I think it should remain a thought experiment. And if you're an engineer of a self-driving car, you probably agree as well, because you know that a self-driving car is not going to be able to calculate the difference between the utilitarian outcomes of 5 deaths versus 1 death. So it's a bit of a false problem, but it does raise an important question, which is that robots making decisions that have value considerations and that have differential outcomes, right, in which some people might be harmed, some people might benefit, some people might be harmed, that is a profound question for society to have to deal with. And this isn't just artificial intelligence telling us what program to watch next on Netflix, right? This is artificial intelligence in control of 2 tons of steel, and that is a really important question for society. But I use, in terms of the ethical dilemma, I think, the ones that actually matter we have already seen. So 2 years ago, when an Uber self-driving car killed a woman, Elaine Herzberg, right, the real ethical dilemma there was something that engineers were programming to, and that was the question of how you balance false positives against false negatives. So self-driving cars will never be able to know the world perfectly. They won't be omniscient in the same way as human beings aren't, right? We guess at what's ahead based on previous experience and all the rest of it. And when Uber's engineers were deciding how to tune their system, right, they were deciding, should we worry about shadows on the road and paper bags and other things that actually drivers would just ignore, and they tuned their system so that, as it was, it failed to account for a woman pushing a bicycle across a road where, yes, she shouldn't have been, right, because jaywalking in America is illegal, but still it showed you that there was a real ethical dilemma there in terms of how the engineers were trying to understand the uncertainty. And I think that tells us more about the risks and opportunities of a self-driving car.
So how does that work then? So, I mean, how could it work in the future? Because I guess, especially in America, someone is always going to want to sue someone. So was it the engineers who made that decision? Was it that the person who bought the car took on that responsibility? Was it the government for allowing the car to be on the road in the first place? It feels like there's going to be a lot of fights about this. What's the landscape there?
Yeah, and in America, the way that this is worked out often is through those fights, right? It is worked out in the courts, which is one reason why, in that case, Uber settled out of court, because they did not want those fights to happen in public. So for somebody like me interested in responsible innovation, I would look at that and say, yes, clearly engineers were making really consequential decisions there, but they were making those decisions responding to a set of incentives that came from a Silicon Valley tech firm saying, we're in a race. We need to develop this technology faster than anybody else. We need to win. We need to show that we can do this. Incentives to cover up what you're doing, incentives to test in public without telling the people that live in that area that you're testing in their community, right? So I think it's wrong just to blame the engineers themselves, because the engineers were working in a particular corporate context, right? And you compare Uber's test. Other companies were testing in a far more responsible way. Uber started testing in a more responsible way after that death. One of the tragedies of innovation is that often, it takes a catastrophe to get people to change their approach.
So one of the things that sort of it follows on from that, I guess, is so one of the things when I think about a world with self-driving cars, I can see that 100%, whatever happens in the future, 100% self-driving cars is not anywhere on the horizon in the next few decades, for a few reasons. One of them being that people like driving cars and all the trust issues that you mentioned. So whatever happens, we're looking at this kind of half and half world where not only might there be half autonomous cars and half not, or self-driving cars, but also the level of self-drive, like the level of attention you have to, like, just within one car, I either want to be completely in control or completely not in control. And the idea of having to remember that this car is one that will change lanes for me, but it won't do an emergency stop, right? That there's that, and then there's the half and half, like there's this enormously mixed world. How do we navigate all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a world of human-machine interaction that we will have to come to terms with in exactly the ways that you describe, right? So all the evidence is that humans are really bad at being what's called on the loop. Okay, it's okay if humans are in the loop, working with robots to achieve a sort of task. What humans are really bad at is being on the loop, where they're monitoring an automated system to do a job. And we know this from aeroplane autopilots, that highly trained pilots overseeing autopilots do it very badly. They become less skilled with time and all the rest of it, which means that if you're behind the wheel of a Tesla and you're turning on autopilot, that is a really dangerous situation, and it requires a lot of additional skills that I think most drivers do not have. The other interaction that you're talking about is an interaction between different types of road user, if you like, some of which may be automated some of the time, some of which may be controlled by humans. And the sort of 100% self-driving car situation that you described, actually, that's really, really easy, right? To imagine a world in which the only things on the road are self-driving cars, in engineering terms, that's a really easy problem.
Well, there's those little pods near Heathrow Airport, aren't there, where there's little tracks, and they've just got little pods on, and they're all the same little pods, and they all know where they're going, and it's fine.
And if a dog or a granny or a rabbit gets in their way, then that's probably their fault, right? Because the system is protected. I mean, we in London have the Docklands Light Railway, which has been driverless for getting on for 40 years, maybe 30 years. And the reason it works is because it's a closed system. Nothing else is allowed into that system. Easy. I completely agree that we're not going to have a 100% self-driving world in 50 years' time. I would go so far as to say we will never have a 100% self-driving world. All you need to do is look at the fact that we still have horses on the streets of London, right?
I saw some this morning, actually. I went out for a run this morning and I genuinely saw some horses.
There you go. And other than motorways, where we say you're not allowed to cycle, you're not allowed to be on a horse, right? Our roads are extremely diverse places. I think the interesting, where it's going to become politically contentious is when, for example, a self-driving car company says, well, actually, our technology is much safer than the alternatives, but in order for it to work, we need you to get rid of your pedestrians on this type of road. We need to not have cyclists there, or cyclists are in a separate lane, and we just need the world to be tidied up to suit our sensors and to suit our AI. And maybe we also need the world to be made a bit more machine readable. So we're going to need you to take or add to your traffic lights a thing that says, because it's stupid, a self-driving car looking to see if a traffic light is red or green, right? It's really stupid when the traffic light could just communicate its status directly to the self-driving car wirelessly. And you're going to start to see those sorts of things where there might just be little tweaks made to the world, or little ways in which the world is organised in favour of a self-driving car, where if you want to drive your horse, then... Or
yeah, I like the idea of driving a horse, but yeah.
Or whatever. I don't know what does one do to a horse?
I think you ride it or lead it. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of those things.
So if you are a horse driver, you might feel rather aggrieved at the attempt to organise the world. And I think there's some really nice lessons from history here, because some of that happened with the arrival of the car in American cities at the start of the 20th century. Right? That in effect, the car lobby got hold of city governments and said, at the moment, your streets are a mess. You've got trams, horses,
horse poo everywhere.
You've got electric cars. You've got internal combustion engine cars. You've got people walking in all directions. It's a mess. It's not safe and it's not fast. And so, what American cities did in a lot of cases was ban jaywalking. Right? They said, in effect, streets are for cars.
I didn't know that's where it came from. It really bugs me in America that not only, it's not just the jaywalking. I mean, they actually treat walking on a sidewalk, on the pavement, as there must be something wrong with you. There's a really strong culture that came from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That humans on their own feet, are not meant to be on the street. The street is for the cars.
And that now means that if you're in an American city and you want to, for example, encourage people to travel actively, right, to walk or cycle or whatever, it's really hard, because not only is that not a part of your culture, but also the houses are too far apart. You can't, you're probably, your commute to work's going to be too far and all the rest of it. So these things have massive consequences for the future, but sometimes we only realise those consequences decades later. And
so did they know at the time that was a battle? Were they aware, this sort of manoeuvring to take control of the streets so that they were suitable for cars? Were they aware of that being a big, was it set up as a battle, or was it kind of a creeping thing that just happened by accident?
So it's more of the creeping thing, right? And a lot of it was based on technological hype at the time. So the car lobby right at the end of the 19th century in the US were selling their technology as they were saying, this is going to be cleaner, it's going to be faster, it's going to be safer, right? So safety was the argument. You're not going to get run over by horses, right? And so all of those things, they failed to take account of the long-term implications of that technology. And, as you say, one of the big problems that, if you were to ask people what are the problems that need solving in American cities at the end of the 19th century, they would have said, well, there's a lot of horse poo all over the place.
Right, let's solve that problem first.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested in how all of this you mentioned electric cars there, because of course there were electric cars back then they lost a different battle for different reasons, but it seems that the self-driving cars and the electric vehicles, they're kind of coming along at the same time, and sometimes it's hard to almost to tell the difference between the two of them. What's your view on that sort of? Because they're two completely separate issues, and yet they're sort of merging. What's all that about?
Yes, they are sort of merging, and they're sort of merging under a sort of, if you are a city that wants to embrace not just novelty and modernity, but also some idea of clean growth, right? You might have swallowed a story that not only are self-driving cars safer, but also they're greener in some way. If you look at the self-driving cars that are shuttling people around, most of in most cases, the developers of those self-driving cars, they don't really care what the actual vehicle is, right? It just needs to be a vehicle that they can shove their software into. In most cases, they are hybrid vehicles, and I think that's because you do need a massive battery to power your computers. Right, so you might as well have a massive battery powering your computers and your drivetrain at the same time. But there's no sense in which a self-driving car is inevitably an electric car. And there's one of the concerns that some people who think about self-driving cars and sustainability would raise is, well, does it actually make it more likely that we're going to have a world in which the internal combustion engine car is still all over the place? It just happens to be driven by a computer, right? And maybe instead we should be aiming for forms of sustainable shared transport that don't look like cars. So I think it's sort of easy to be seduced into thinking that self-driving cars are necessarily a sort of a cleaner option.
So when it comes, I mean, so there's all these big questions, there's all these complicated things. What do we do about all of this, right? Right now, this second, as we sit here talking, there are a load of people in lots of car companies and lots of tech companies. I mean, it's actually quite interesting that, like a lot of other things, there's the tech companies doing the car thing and the car companies doing the tech thing. And so there's two lots of them. And then there's a pandemic on, there's a lot of other problems in the world. And it feels like what is the good way forward for all of this? What discussion do we need to have, and how do we apply pressure to make sure that good decisions get made and not bad ones?
The answer is to flip the conversation around. So in most of these discussions, we tend to start with the technology, and we think, what is that technology going to do? Right? We look at what's happening in artificial intelligence, and we say, wow, that's exciting, and it's going so quickly. And then we sort of maybe ask ourselves, well, what might that mean for me or my community or the country or whatever? I think we do need to flip it around. We need to start with what mobility should look like in the future. What do we want our worlds to look like in the future? And then how does technology solve those worlds? Which means that the technology companies are not going to come up with the answers, right? We need to have... That's a responsibility for governments, it's for civil society, it's for a massive range of people to imagine a desirable world. What do we want our cities to look like? Do we want them to be denser? Do we want our commutes to be shorter? In which case, what do our forms of transport look like that enable that? And once we have worked through some ideas of what a good future is, some of those technologies will make sense and others won't. But we don't want to be just sort of tricked into sleepwalking towards particular technologies just because they're the technologies that are on offer at the moment. I mean, if you're a car company, we know that car companies are worried about, what their business looks like in 50 years' time, maybe even in 10, 20 years' time. And we should, take that into account and not be fooled into just following what's good for car companies.
So where are the levers, though, in all this? It sounds like, because there's always this problem with very fast innovation, that obviously the companies know what's happening before the government does, because they're the ones that are doing it, usually in secret for commercial reasons. And the consumers are just kind of hanging around over here going, oh, I just want to go somewhere. Like, is there... where... It feels like I feel powerless in this, basically. I guess I can't change what Tesla decides to do. I can't choose to buy a Tesla car, which is one system and not the other one. There's so many issues to vote on. I don't know how to vote to ask a government to pay more attention to this. Like, what do we actually do in practice? Who do we poke to make this all better?
It's a really good question, particularly, just as consumers, we may have really limited power, because probably by the time that we are choosing between different options, right, some of these things are baked in and it's too late to really make a difference. I would say the interesting question is about what role we have as citizens, or look at a particular level, look at a level of government like the city. For example, a city has a really interesting role to play in this at the moment, because cities do plan transport strategies. They think, what does good transport look like? What sort of mix of public and private, autonomous and organised transport should we have in the future? I would say one of the really interesting levers for self-driving cars in particular is that these things have to be tested in public at some point, and they have to be tested on public roads, which makes for a really interesting innovation, right? This isn't like other bits of tech where you can just develop the thing in a private laboratory, finish it, and then release it onto the world and go, da-da, do you like it or not? So one of the interesting things is that the technology is being developed in some places in front of our eyes. And so that then for a city becomes an important question of, should we allow these technologies to be tested on our roads? Maybe we want to be a sort of innovative, exciting place like Phoenix, Arizona wants to be, so it's allowed self-driving cars to be tested on its road. But if these companies want to do their stuff on our roads, then what should we ask of these companies in return? Right? You get into quite an interesting conversation. And some American cities have said, yes, you can test in our city, but only if you share your data. Some cities in Britain have said, yes, you can test your technology in this little part of our city, which is a transport desert, right? Doesn't have good transport links at the moment. And maybe you can fill in some gaps in our transport network so you're not just competing with the bus route, right? Because we don't want people to suddenly stop getting in buses and start getting in little shuttles, which will make traffic worse. So you can start to see some really interesting conversations take place between cities and towns and the people providing the tech, where these things do get worked out. So it's not just moving fast and breaking things.
Brilliant. And just before, we're running slightly out of time, but there's so much here. Is there any sort of recommended reading or anything if people are more interested in finding out a bit more about all of this, are there any books or websites you could recommend that have a bit more information?
So there's a few books on self-driving cars that have come out recently. Most of them, I have to say, are just really, really excited about everything. And I don't think there's much value to be had from reading how exciting everything is. There's a new book that came out very recently by Anthony Townsend called The Ghost Road, which has some interesting, real analysis of what self-driving cars might mean for our world. There's some really good reporting that goes inside tech companies to ask, what are they actually doing? A lot of the reporting, I have to say, is just repeating whatever Elon Musk said last week. So I would encourage people to read the huge amount of stuff that is online with a critical eye. Brilliant,
great. Yeah, I think that will have to do, because there is so much more to talk about, but we are out of time. Thank you so much for talking to us, Jack. It's been brilliant.
Thanks, Helen.
I hope you enjoyed that. It does sound as though we all need to pay a bit more attention to these issues and to help our cities and governments make good decisions for the future rather than just good decisions for tech companies now. So, there's all these shiny new toys and it's really hard to see beyond, here's a new toy, but actually we do need to think about what the future looks like. So if you'd like this and you'd like to support us, please do join in with the whole, be enthusiastic about the whole Fully Charged thing. You can support us on Patreon. You're probably already subscribed to this podcast, and the website Fully Charged Show has loads of good stuff on it. So do take a look at all of that. And if you have been, thank you for listening.